It's quite nice to come back after a long time and hear some of the discussions seem very, very similar to me to those from quite a long time ago. In the Renewable Energy Division at the IEA, what we do is really 3 or 4 main things. We look at the progress in the technologies for renewable energy, and in particular we've produced a number of roadmaps which talk about the evolution of the technology and how you can get from where we are now to where we need to be in terms of low carbon scenarios. We look at what is actually happening in the global markets for the various technologies, and a lot of what I will say is based on this medium-term market report, which was published about 2 weeks ago, and is an annual publication we do which tracks what's happening in the renewable energy markets. We also look at renewable energy policies as they're developed around the world and what's happening to those. And we also have a special attention to the integration issues, particularly how you integrate variable renewable electricity generation into grid systems. So what I thought I would do this morning is really put some of the discussions that you've been having about bioenergy and energy crops in particular into the context of what's happening in the renewable energy market developments as a whole, based on our market report, looking at electricity, heat and the transport sectors, and then go back a bit and look at within some of the IEA's long-term energy scenarios, particularly the low carbon scenarios, what's the role that bioenergy we would hope would play in that, and what are some of the issues in achieving that. And then I'm going to end up with some questions for you really about how you see some of the barriers to the development of energy crops can be overcome to deliver what's in those energy scenarios. Just a few words about the changes in the globe, some of the changes in the global energy markets, which of course affect the context in which renewables are operating, and in fact all the technologies. In the past year or so, we've seen a huge drop in oil prices, and this does 2 things really. One, it raises the question about the competitiveness of renewables, but also it takes the pressure off a little bit, because in many countries it's not actually greenhouse gas savings or other things which are the main driver for renewables, it's energy security and issues, and that's fueled by the pressure of import bills. So what's the medium-term impact of this change in oil prices? In fact, we're seeing in the electricity sector very little impact of that, but maybe in some of the other sectors, the more biofuels, bioenergy-related sectors for heating and for transport fuels, that could have a big impact. The oil price was actually preceded by very big changes in gas prices, particularly in the US with shale gas and so on and so forth, and so there's a constant turmoil in what's been happening in the fossil fuel sector. Now what we're seeing is, to some extent, that the renewables sector so far has been relatively sheltered from all that movement, because the drivers are pretty robust. People still want to diversify their energy systems. Local pollution is a very strong issue in China, and decarbonisation, of course, is still on the table. We've seen the costs for some of the main renewable sources of electricity, particularly wind and solar, as I'll explain a bit more later. We've seen those drop dramatically, which has a big impact, because it means that countries who are not particularly wealthy but who actually have extremely good wind and solar resources are now in a position to pick up these technologies and run with them, and we're seeing that. That has a bit of a knock-on effect to bioenergy, because going back, bioenergy as a source of electricity was a viable renewable source, and quite a low-cost renewable source, but it's sort of gone down a little bit at least in the economic pecking order. And then, of course, if you look forward to the COP meeting in a month or so's time, and you look at the pledges that countries have made to that to reduce their emissions, actually renewables play a huge role in that. So there is still this strategic drive to press on with the renewables. Now, if we look at, first of all, at what's been happening in the renewables electricity market, and you'll see what's been happening in the market for the last 10 years, and then our forecast as to what we see going forward. Now, you see there's been quite a steady growth in that deployment. The big blue bit at the bottom is hydro, and then the coloured bars at the top, which is where most of the growth has been, is in the newer technologies, including bioenergy. Now, 2014, in terms of deployment, was actually a record year for renewable electricity deployment. There were 130 gigawatts of electricity installed in 2013. It wasn't actually a record in terms of investment in renewables because of these cost reductions I was talking about. Actually, the amount of investment you need to deliver that has come down a bit. And actually, we see the trend there going forward. We expect this growth to continue. But while in the earlier parts of this period, actually the growth was accelerating, we now expect there to be more or less constant capacity additions every year from now going forward to 2020, which is good in some ways, but whereas in the past we've been on a trajectory which has been quite close to that which is needed by low carbon scenarios, we're now starting to drop away from that. You can see here that the growth is being, I mean, there is a steady growth in hydro, but actually most of the growth has been in the non-hydro renewable sources. You can see going back to 2005, only 10% of the total renewable generation came from non-hydro sources. But that's more than doubled, that percentage has more than doubled by now, and we expect that to get up to almost 40% by 2020. Just to put this in context, in 2014, there was about 22% of global electricity came from renewable sources, and that 22% is about the same as that from gas, and it's about twice that of nuclear. So just to put that in context. So this isn't a small scale show, this is a big thing in global energy terms. Now, what about bioenergy within this? You see the little dark green bar there is the bioenergy component. And you see that if you look at the non-hydro part, going back to 2005, more than half of that was from bioenergy, which was a well-established, relatively low-cost non-hydro renewable source. You see that actually the growth in the other technologies has been much quicker than that in bioenergy for electricity. And that share has dropped to about 20% 2014, and we expect that to go down, continue to go down, because of the very rapid rise of the blue bit, which is wind, and then more recently the yellow part, which is sort of photovoltaics. Wind has been growing at 20-something% over a long period, and solar at even greater rates than that recently. But if you look at the bioenergy component of that too has been growing. You can see a steady progress there. This slide shows that growth broken down by region. You can see the green part there is basically the European market, which has been growing quite strongly, driven by the Renewable Energy Directive and the targets there. We expect that growth to continue, but to flatten off a bit. But you can see in recent years and going forward, the major area for growth in this sector are the orange and pinky orange bars, which are Asia and China. And China, bioenergy for power generation has been growing pretty rapidly, and we expect that to continue given the very strong policy drivers they have. I mentioned this question of the costs of technologies. You can see here the blue and yellow bars show what's been happening and what we expect to happen in terms of the costs of generation from wind and from solar. And you can see, particularly from solar, you can see from between 2010 and now there's been an absolutely huge drop in costs. Wind, it's been a more steady projection, and we expect those cost reductions to continue both in wind and solar. And so in a lot of places now, you can get energy from these sources at between about $70 and $100 per megawatt hour. We've also put on here a range of estimates for generation from the various biomass technologies, and you can see that actually just on a per megawatt hour basis, these technologies are starting to look a bit more expensive in a lot of cases than the energy from other sources. Now what we're also seeing is that as some of these technologies move into some of the wind and solar technologies move into countries which have very, very good resources. I mean, if you think about North Africa has twice as much sun as Germany, more or less. Then we're actually seeing even much lower costs than those I've shown here. So bioenergy is starting to look, in some cases, as quite an expensive option in the spectrum of renewable energy power generation sources, except where you have a very low cost feedstock, or where where you're able to do co-firing and so on and so forth, or where there are other co-benefits. I won't go into detail on this, but this just demonstrates some of the more recent prices we've seen for some of the wind and solar technologies. And as it moves to countries with better resources, you see we're getting down to, in the wind case, down to about less than $50 a megawatt hour, and solar is now at 58, I think, is the best. So these technologies have gone from being very expensive options to being rather cost competitive, but there isn't the same technology stretch in the bioenergy for power generation. And then what we're seeing is changes in policies which reflect some of these changes. In some cases, these are having a positive impact on the marketplace for bioenergy for power. You can see here in Canada, in Brazil, in Korea, there are measures being taken which are probably positive as far as bioenergy is concerned. But in some other countries, particularly in European countries, the policy regime is tightening as far as bioenergy is concerned, in Germany, in Poland, in the UK. And this is at least in part in response to concerns about the cost competitiveness of bioenergy for power generation and its link to other sources. So that's a snapshot of what's been happening in the power sector. Now, if you look at between the three main sectors, the power sector, the heat sector and the transport sector, you can see that actually the role of bioenergy in the renewables power sector is actually quite small. As you've seen, the share's been declining. If you add hydro in there, it's less than 10% of the total. The sectors where bioenergy plays a much bigger role are in the heating sector, where, as we'll see, most of the renewable heat comes from bioenergy, and in the transport sector, where biofuels are the dominant source. Of course, you can have renewable electricity in the transport sector, but then you have to be a bit careful about double counting if that electricity is being counted, if that electricity is already being counted somewhere else. So, but most renewable efforts in transport rely on biofuels. And as we'll see, actually these sectors have been much less dynamic than the electricity sector. So if we look at biofuels, you see this historical track. You see that over the period between about 2005 and 2010, there was a very strong growth globally in the production and use of biofuels. And this was due particularly to what was happening in the US, where there was a big expansion in corn-based ethanol, but also expansion in Brazil, in EU and in other markets. And then you see we've run into almost a plateau phase, which coincided with a number of things. It coincided with some difficult weather events in a number of countries, but it also coincided with growing concerns about the overall sustainability of biofuels. You'll remember the huge debates in 2010, 2011 about that, and particularly concerns about the greenhouse gas balances associated with biofuels production, and then leading on to the long discussions about indirect land use change and so on and so forth. So we see that biofuels, we think, are sort of plateauing out at the moment, and unless some of these policy uncertainties and some of these these things are resolved. It's quite hard to see how a climate is going to be produced, but it actually encourages a lot of investment in biofuels technology. I mean, in Europe, measures have been put in place which assure the position till 2020, but the position beyond that to 2030 and beyond that is still pretty unclear. I think it would be a brave man who took $1 billion and invested it in biofuels production in Europe at the moment, for example. So this policy uncertainty is probably undermining at the moment the prospects in that area. Nonetheless, we do see some slight growth. This shows that, I mean, oil prices, as the graph shows in the black line, have come down, but to a large extent, biofuels production has so far been sheltered from that by the fact that most countries have mandates in place, and until people start backpedaling on their mandates, we expect to see biofuels at least maintained and maybe growing just slightly. And again, if you look at the policy landscape, there's a bit of a mixed picture. In a number of countries, measures have been taken which lead to a more favourable climate for biofuels, particularly in some of the Asian countries, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, and so on and so forth, who are increasing or putting in place or increasing mandates and so on and so forth for biofuels, whereas the situation in the US, in Europe, and so on and so forth is more complicated and not so supportive. Now, one key element in the development of the biofuel sector is the move away from conventional crop-based biofuels, such as corn-based ethanol or biodiesel, to advanced biofuels, cellulosic ethanol, cellulosic-based products produced by thermal processes and so on and so forth. And this was, to a large extent, this was the great white hope of the biofuel sector, and the way to get around and away from some of the concerns about sustainability issues, about improving the overall carbon balance, and also minimizing the impact on or minimizing the competition with food-based biofuels. And for a number of years, there have been a number of commercial developments in the pipeline that haven't actually quite got to the finishing line. But in the last year or so, we've seen quite a number of plants have actually now broken through that barrier and are now quite large-scale commercial plants which are now in operation. You can see some examples here in Italy, in Finland, in China, in Canada, and in the US. And so this is quite a milestone that we've got to the point where these technologies are at least now being demonstrated at a large scale. The technology, I think, is now being demonstrated. It's not necessarily the case that these plants are running full out, because I think there are still some economic concerns and so on and so forth which are holding back them going full throttle. And further, while there's quite a pipeline of future biofuels plants on the books, whether these will be built, given some of the policy uncertainties I referred to, we'll have to wait and see. But we do expect to see some growth in biofuels markets. These are mostly based on residues rather than energy crops, but we do expect to see some some growth in that sector. We've been looking with some of the industry people about what the estimates of the costs are for these technologies. Basically, these plants are only likely to be competitive at oil prices very much above those that we have now. However, in the industry, people tell us that if they could actually get into serial production, if they could run the plants and produce 5 or 6 more plants after that, then actually the costs of this production could come down and be around $60, $70. So that's the biofuels picture, which is a bit clouded and difficult. Let's look at the heating sector. The heating sector's a bit complicated because, first of all, you have to distinguish between traditional biomass, and as this graph shows, in many countries, and particularly in Africa, traditional biomass is very much used. It's a very important source of heating and cooking power, and actually probably is not not sustainable from a whole number of points of view, neither from the supply side in many cases, nor from the point of view of the use. I mean, the fuel is used with a 10% efficiency, you have huge air pollution problems and so on and so forth. However, if we try and disentangle that traditional biomass from what we call modern biomass, modern renewables, this is the picture we have for the development of modern renewable energy for heat over the last 10 years and going forward to 2020. And here you can see bioenergy is the dominant source. You can see that the yellow bit, which is solar heating, has been growing quite strongly from a small base. This is particularly due to the very widespread development of solar for heating in China. And you can see the small red bit at the top is geothermal. These are technologies which are pretty standard, pretty well developed. In a lot of cases they can be cost competitive, but we're only seeing a pretty slow progress in these technologies. When you look at why that is, one of the reasons for that is that policy in renewables is focused almost entirely on the electricity sector, and there are relatively few countries who actually take the heating sector seriously. There are 120 countries, I think it is, who have renewable electricity policies in place. There are only about 40 or 50 that actually have renewable heating policies in place. So we think that's one of the reasons why this sector isn't progressing as quickly as it could. I think there are other reasons, particularly the very fragmented nature of the industry, which means you don't really get progression, and you really don't get the ambition to actually do things to drive down costs and grow the market very quickly in many cases. Now, I think this is a particular case where the change in oil prices is increasing the competition. You can see this graph here shows the forecast growth for wood pellet installations in Austria, and you can see this showed expected quite strong growth from next year and then increasing a bit further on. The graph shows pellet stoves in blue at the bottom and pellet boilers at the top. So the market has been growing and is expected to continue to grow, but we're now seeing that the margin between the costs of pellets being supplied to that market and the oil price has really been squeezed. And I think it's now expected that those earlier forecasts will probably prove to be a bit optimistic, unless, of course, as is always possible, the oil price rebounds considerably. If you look at the three sectors, the biofuel, the bioenergy for power sector has been growing at about 5.5%, so it's actually been growing quite steadily. The other sectors, the biofuels production and the heat sector, have been growing at much lower rates than that. And given that actually, if you look at total world energy demand, then electricity is a relatively small part of that, and at least half of total world energy demand is in the heating sector. If we really want to go to a high decarbonisation strategy, we need quite quickly to find ways of getting these other sectors to move in the same way that the power sector has been doing. So let me go now and talk a little bit about scenarios. The IEA, as you probably know, is a great producer of scenarios. We have the World Energy Outlook, which has sets of scenarios in. We also have the Energy Technology Perspectives publication, which has a whole set of scenarios, in particular looking at a sort of business as usual scenario, which is called the 6-degree scenario, because that's what probably would happen to global temperatures, and a 2-degree scenario, which is what you have to do to try and get to a position where you've got some degree of stabilisation in emissions. And you can see here, this is from this year's report, you see actually to go from that high scenario to a low carbon scenario, you need a whole spectrum of technologies which all need to be deployed in order to bring emissions down. So you have everything from nuclear, CCS, and a lot of energy efficiency, but you can also see the light blue bar there, that renewables are an absolute key to this reduction. Now, if you look at the three scenarios, the 6-degree scenario, the 4-degree scenario, and the 2-degree scenario, and you look at the primary energy demand under the three scenarios, you can see in the first two, there is actually a significant degree increase in total primary energy demand. And some of that, in the 6-degree scenario, a lot of that comes from fossil fuels and a relatively small component from non-fossil. In the 4-degree scenario, it's somewhere in the middle. But in the 2-degree scenario, then two things happen. First of all, you have a reduction in fossil fuel demand, and you have a big increase in the renewables component. That's the bioenergy component. And actually, in the 2DS scenario, bioenergy becomes the largest primary energy carrier by 2050. In fact, if you look at the other scenarios, even in the 6-degree scenario, then the bioenergy component increases. But particularly in the low carbon scenario, you need to have a big component coming from bioenergy. And this is true in the IEA scenarios, but actually if you look at any of the other low carbon scenarios, you find the same thing. A few years ago, we produced some roadmaps looking at what you would need to do to deliver those sorts of outcomes from a bioenergy point of view. We looked at the biomass supply. In order to deliver that, you need around 160 exajoules of biomass supply to feed that, which I think is about 8 to 11 billion tons, depending where that comes from. And about half of that we thought might come from waste and residues, and the other half from crops. And I think it's not always a very useful debate to get into how much biomass could there be and so on and so forth, because it's also uncertain. But we took the view then that actually there probably was enough biomass to go around to supply that need. But if you look at the biofuel sector, you see there that we saw a big increase in the amount of biofuels, up to about 32 exajoules. I think the current ETP model is a little bit less than that, but not much. But it also showed a big change from the current picture of biofuels production, which is almost entirely ethanol and biodiesel based, to a much broader spectrum of bio-based fuels, and particularly fuels which can play a role in the diesel and kerosene markets. Because actually the other sectors, there are other ways you can decarbonise those, but actually long-haul transport is much harder to decarbonise in other ways. So there's a particular role for biofuels in those large, in those long-haul transport sectors, but you probably need different feedstocks and certainly different technologies to supply those, for example, to get into the aviation sector. Going with this was a big growth in the feedstock supply. As I said, about half of which came from residues, but the other half came from energy crops, and a big chunk of that would need to comes from cellulosic energy crops. So far, we've seen, as you've seen, an increase in biofuels production. We've seen the technologies, at least some of the technologies required for this transition, starting to get to commercialization stage. We haven't yet seen the technologies, the thermal-based technologies, which you need to produce some of these fuels really coming through. And we really haven't seen a move yet to energy crops. Most of the projects which are based so far are based on residues. I'll end with some questions or some points we might want to discuss. First of all, I've been trying to find out how much energy crops there really are in the ground. It's actually quite hard to do that. I think there's about 150,000 hectares of energy crops in Europe, but I'm not sure about that, and I haven't been able to find out what's happening in the rest of the world. So if anybody knows the answer to that or has views on that, I mean, that is a significant amount, but compared with the numbers I've been talking about, that's a drop in the bucket. I think there are persistent questions about the costs. Can you actually really produce both the residues and the energy crops at a large scale at costs which are going to make competitive feedstocks for these large-scale uses? And then one of the big things which happened since we wrote the roadmaps is the whole development of the discussion about carbon balances, and particularly the context of the ILUC debate and the food versus fuel debate and so on and so forth. To what extent can we really argue that dedicating land entirely to energy crops is actually in line with these things? I think this is a huge political issue at the moment, and I think it tends to put bioenergy into this is very hard to think about category and is a bit of an inhibition to action. And then lastly, the chicken and egg problem. To get this going, you need very large areas of bioenergy and biocrop production. People aren't going to plant that unless there's an output, but you're not going to have the output unless you've got the crops. So I see these some of the challenges which I'd be very interested to discuss with you. I think my own view is that we really have to think about bioenergy as part in a broader context. First of all, bioenergy, I think, has to be very efficiently integrated and used through, where possible, CHP schemes and so on and so forth in terms of urban applications. But probably to make the books balance, you probably need to bring into that some other benefits, which might be from some sort of environmental services in terms of emissions reduction, waste and so on and so forth. It might be through the integration with other agricultural and forestry products, or it may well be through the production not just of energy products, but through the co-production with bio-based materials of one sort or another. I think this is probably what we need to put more emphasis on, not just how can we take a resource or some land and just produce an energy crop, but how can we produce a spectrum of materials which optimizes the overall value of that, and both in financial terms and in terms of land use.